Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be talking about artificial intelligence in medicine.
AI in medicine. I
And
know, right?
we have just this incredible collection of sources here talking about how pervasive AI is becoming in every aspect of healthcare, from spotting, signs of diabetic eye disease in images
Mm.
to predicting which patients might need to be readmitted to the hospital,
Really?
and even accelerating that incredibly complex process of discovering new drugs.
Yeah, it's really quite remarkable the speed at which it's being integrated in all these different areas.
It really is. And the potential upside here is just
It's
massive.
huge.
Think about lower costs, clearer communication, boosts in productivity,
Mm.
happier patients, happier doctors,
Mm.
better health outcomes, faster scientific breakthroughs. I mean,
It's a really exciting time to be looking at this, and I think it's something that really has the potential to transform healthcare as we know it.
absolutely. But as these AI systems get
Right.
smarter and more capable, this really fundamental question arises. And it's really the core of what we're diving into today.
Mm.
Can we genuinely trust medical AI
Right.
in the same way that we trust the human doctors who care for us?
That's the question, isn't it?
Or are we actually developing like a sophisticated form of reliance
Right.
on these technologies?
I think that's a really important distinction to make.
It is, and that subtle difference, as we'll see over the course of our conversation today, has really profound implications for the very heart of healthcare, which is the doctor-patient relationship.
Absolutely. It
Yeah.
really gets to the core of how we think about healthcare and what's important in the interaction between a doctor and a patient.
Absolutely. So over the course of our conversation, we're going to explore this from a few different angles. First, we're going to unpack what genuine trust actually means, in the context of medicine and that crucial human connection.
Mhm.
Then we'll look at just how quickly AI is advancing and the very real possibility of it surpassing human capabilities.
Yeah.
Some pretty critical medical tasks.
Which is happening faster than I think a lot of people realize.
It really is. And then finally, we'll delve into some thought-provoking philosophical arguments
Yeah.
that suggest why, no matter how reliable AI becomes,
Mm-hmm.
trusting, it might not be the same as trusting another person.
Right. And that's, I think, where it gets really interesting because, we can build systems that are incredibly reliable and incredibly good at doing certain things.
Hmm.
But whether that translates into the same kind of trust that we have in another human being, that's a really complex question.
Yeah, that's where I think it starts to get a little bit slippery.
Yeah.
So let's unpack this. What makes trust so essential to healthcare to begin with?
Well, I think trust in medicine has both what we might call an intrinsic and an instrumental significance.
Okay.
Intrinsically, it's really the foundation of that really unique and vital bond between a doctor and a patient.
Right.
When someone's ill, when they're vulnerable, they turn to a physician and they're essentially placing their well-being,
Yeah.
literally in that person's hands.
It's a huge leap of faith.
It is. It really is. And they're trusting in their competence and ideally experiencing empathy
Mhm.
and genuine care from that physician.
Right. So there's that kind of vulnerability.
There is.
Yeah.
And as one of our sources really beautifully puts it, trust is inseparable from vulnerability in that there is no need for trust in the absence of vulnerability.
Wow, that's a great quote.
It's really powerful. It gets to the heart of why trust is so important in this context, because if you weren't vulnerable, if you didn't need help, you would need to trust anyone.
Right. You wouldn't be taking that risk.
Exactly. And this vulnerability creates this power dynamic, which is really, I think, at the core of why physicians are held to such a high fiduciary duty. They are ethically obligated to act in their patient's best interests.
Which makes sense because of that power dynamic, because of that inherent vulnerability.
Exactly.
Okay, so we talked about intrinsic value. You also mentioned instrumental value. So it's not just like a nice feeling, right?
Not at all.
Trust is actually
not.
doing some work here.
Yeah. Trust instrumentally acts as a really powerful catalyst for positive outcomes.
Okay.
So patients who have a strong sense of trust in their doctors are far more likely to accept the recommended treatments and actually adhere to the prescribed plans. They're more willing to share sensitive information, participate in research, maintain a consistent relationship with their doctor, and even recommend that doctor to others.
Right, and all of those things are going to feed back into better care.
Exactly. And beyond those practical benefits, there's growing evidence that a trusting doctor-patient relationship can actually have what we might call a therapeutic effect in itself.
Interesting.
So it can potentially contribute to improved health outcomes and even play a role in, that well-known placebo effect.
So it's not just about feeling better about the process, it's actually potentially affecting the physiological outcomes.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think more and more research is pointing in that direction.
That's fascinating.
It is, and ultimately, I think when a patient feels genuine trust in their caregiver, they're more likely to feel truly cared for. And that's really what we want at the end of the day, right?
Absolutely. So it's not just a pleasant aspect of care, it's actually fundamental to effective medical practice.
It really is.
Now, our sources draw a really important distinction between interpersonal trust and social trust.
Okay.
Can you clarify that for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So in our deep dive today, when we talk about trust, we're specifically focusing on interpersonal trust.
Okay.
The direct trust that exists between individual people, like the trust between a doctor and a specific patient.
Right.
Social trust, on the other hand, is a much broader concept. It refers to the trust that we might have in institutions or societal structures,
Okay.
like the hospital system or the medical profession as a whole.
Got it.
So while social trust certainly plays a role in healthcare,
Mm.
our primary focus today is on that direct personal relationship and how AI might affect it.
Got it. So, with that understanding of the vital role of human trust in medicine, let's shift our attention to where AI enters the picture.
Okay.
How does the growing role of AI challenge this deeply human dynamic?
Well, I think the way AI impacts trust really depends on the role it ultimately takes in medical practice.
Okay.
If AI remains primarily a tool, something akin to like a very advanced diagnostic instrument that a doctor uses and interprets,
Right.
then its influence on the core element of trust might be relatively limited.
Yeah.
Patients would likely continue to place their trust primarily in the skills and judgment of their human physician.
Yeah, just like they trust the X-ray machine or the MRI machine.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the rapid advancements we're seeing, particularly in fields like deep learning, suggest that AI is evolving beyond being just a tool
Right.
and is beginning to challenge what we might call the epistemic authority of human clinicians.
Okay, what is that?
Epistemic authority. That is their authority as the primary holders of medical knowledge and the ultimate decision makers.
Okay, so like who has the knowledge and who makes the decisions based on that knowledge?
Exactly. And that's where I think things get really interesting.
So our sources emphasize that AI researchers are actively striving to develop systems that can not only assist,
But potentially outperform human doctors in these core clinical tasks, like making an accurate diagnosis, predicting a patient's prognosis, and even determining the most effective course of treatment.
yeah, that's the holy grail, isn't it?
It really is, and it aligns really well with the work of Eric Cassell, who identified those as three fundamental responsibilities of a clinician.
Right.
So when we say epistemic authority, we're essentially talking about who we recognize as the go-to source for reliable knowledge and decisions.
Exactly. Who do we trust to know what's going on and to make the best decisions based on that knowledge?
And it's not just a future aspiration. A significant systematic review and meta-analysis actually found that in certain specific diagnostic tasks, sophisticated deep learning AI systems have already demonstrated an ability to match the diagnostic accuracy of human clinicians.
That's right. And this was a pretty landmark study by Liu and colleagues back in 2019.
2019, so this is not that long ago.
That sounds like a huge breakthrough. But our source also includes a really important footnote regarding this research. What are the key limitations that we need to keep in mind?
Well, it's really important, I think, to interpret these findings with a degree of caution and a critical eye.
Of course, yeah.
The researchers themselves highlighted some significant methodological limitations within the studies that they analyzed.
Okay.
Surprisingly, out of tens of thousands of articles that compared AI and human diagnostic performance,
Wow, tens of thousands.
tens of thousands, only a very small fraction actually conducted those comparisons using the exact same data sets.
Oh, so they weren't necessarily comparing apples to apples.
Not always, no.
That's a huge deal.
It is, and it means that while AI might be achieving human-level accuracy in these very highly controlled research settings, we still need more robust and standardized comparisons
Yeah.
to really understand how it performs in the messy and complex reality of everyday clinical practice.
It's one thing to do in a lab. It's another thing to do it, on the floor of a hospital.
Exactly, and that's a distinction that's often lost in the hype.
Right, and I think that's why that footnote is so important.
Absolutely, it's a crucial caveat.
Okay, so even with those important caveats, the potential for AI to excel in these critical areas is definitely there. And this leads us to a concept mentioned in our source called the anthropocentric predicament,
Okay.
coined by Paul Humphreys. What exactly does that entail?
The anthropocentric predicament essentially describes a situation where Advanced technologies, and in our case AI, could potentially surpass human epistemic abilities.
Okay, so our fundamental ability to like know and understand things.
Exactly. And Humphreys argues that we may be reaching a point where relying solely on human-centered ways of knowing may no longer be the most appropriate approach.
Because we're creating things that know more than we do.
Potentially, yes, at least in certain areas. And he says that there are now superior non-human epistemic authorities.
So if AI does become more knowledgeable and demonstrably more reliable in tasks like diagnosing diseases than a human doctor, how does that fundamentally reshape the landscape of medical practice?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is. Our source touches on two primary perspectives on this: substitutionism and extensionism.
Okay.
Can you break those down for us?
Yeah, substitutionism is the view that as AI technology continues to advance, it will eventually become so proficient that it essentially replaces human doctors altogether,
Okay.
outperforming them across the board.
So like the doctor just goes away and the AI is the doctor?
That's the substitutionist view.
Okay.
Extensionism, on the other hand, proposes that AI will primarily serve as a tool to augment and enhance the capabilities of human clinicians.
Okay, so it's more like a partnership.
Right, like a really advanced assistant.
Got it.
And those who hold this view often emphasize that AI currently lacks these essential human qualities like emotional intelligence and empathy, which are widely considered crucial in providing comprehensive healthcare.
Yeah, those things are really hard to program.
They are, and they point to this as evidence that there will always be a vital role for human practitioners.
Okay, so it sounds like there's a pretty broad range of opinions on this ultimate impact. But even among those who believe that AI will primarily extend human capabilities, there seems to be this acknowledgement that like a significant transformation is on the horizon.
Well, absolutely.
Our source quotes Liu and colleagues referring to a seismic shift.
Yeah.
And it also mentions that even prominent figures like Eric Topol suggest that while entire job roles might not vanish, human roles will likely be significantly redefined, focusing on the aspects of care that really necessitate that human touch.
Right. So maybe we won't need as many doctors to do the things that AI can do better.
Right.
But we'll need them to focus on the things that AI can't do, like providing emotional support and building relationships with patients.
Yeah, and maybe even like helping patients understand and trust
Exactly.
the AI.
Yeah, that's a crucial point.
So the general consensus, even among those who are more cautious, seems to be that AI is going to fundamentally change the way medicine is practiced.
Absolutely.
And if AI does start to consistently outperform humans in these key clinical tasks,
Right.
our source argues that this inevitably leads to a displacement of the epistemic authority we traditionally ascribe to human clinicians. Okay, so let's unpack that specific idea a little bit more.
Yeah.
If an AI is consistently more accurate and reliable in its diagnoses, for example,
Right.
what does that practically mean for the human doctor in that situation?
Well, our source cites the work of Grote and Behrens,
Okay.
who suggest that if a practitioner becomes aware of an epistemic source, in this case an AI system, that is demonstrably more knowledgeable, accurate, and reliable,
Yeah.
they would have an epistemic obligation to treat it as an expert
Okay.
and to align their own professional judgments with the conclusions provided by that AI.
Wow, so almost like they have to kind of defer to
Yeah, there's a sense of deference
the
to
AI.
Yeah, and During and Bush echo this sentiment, stating that in such scenarios, clinicians arguably should defer to the verdicts of the more reliable source.
Wow, that's a pretty significant power dynamic shift. It almost sounds like the doctor's role could evolve into more of like a facilitator.
Yeah, like a translator almost.
Yeah.
Taking the AI's recommendations and explaining them to the patient in a way that makes sense to them.
Yeah, and our source points out that this potential shift aligns with some of the core objectives behind the implementation of AI in medicine.
Right.
Things like alleviating administrative burdens, driving improvements in cost efficiency, and crucially minimizing human error and reducing wastefulness.
Exactly. And if the primary goals are to reduce mistakes and enhance efficiency within the healthcare system, then logically clinicians would need to give significant weight
Yeah.
to the outputs generated by these highly reliable AI systems, potentially even prioritizing them over their own intuition or judgment.
Wow, so we're potentially moving towards a future where patients might find themselves relying more on the objective judgments of AI systems than on the traditional personal authority of their human doctors.
That's a pretty radical shift, isn't it?
It is, and this brings us back to that central question we posed at the beginning, the nature of trust in this new context.
Hmm.
Our source argues that this shift in reliance might lead to a different
Right.
and perhaps less profound kind of trust in
Mm.
medical practice. Why is that the case?
This is where the nuanced philosophical distinctions between the concepts of reliance and trust become absolutely crucial.
Okay.
While we might indeed come to rely very heavily on AI systems for accessing medical information
Mm.
and guiding critical healthcare decisions,
Right.
our source compellingly argues that we cannot truly trust them
Okay.
in the same rich and multifaceted way that we trust a fellow human being like our doctor.
And that word trust is being used a lot.
It is, and I think often without a clear understanding of what it actually means.
And a lot of these conversations are happening at like the EU level and with big technology companies.
Right, and there's this whole discussion around developing trustworthy AI,
Yeah.
often championed by organizations like the EU's high-level expert group on AI and
Mhm.
companies like IBM.
Mm-hmm.
And it tends to really heavily emphasize these aspects, like a system's reliability
Okay.
and accuracy in performing tasks.
Yeah.
And while those are undeniably important,
Of course, like you want it to do what it says it's going to do.
exactly.
Right.
But a lot of philosophical accounts of trust suggest that there's some fundamental elements that are missing
Oh, okay.
when we consider extending the concept of trust to these non-sentient systems.
Okay, so our source uses a couple of really illustrative scenarios to highlight this difference between mere reliance and genuine trust.
Mm-hmm.
Can you walk us through those examples?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first scenario involves a character named Stan, who has observed that his neighbor Jane consistently leaves her house at the same time every Monday morning.
Okay.
Stan relies on Jane continuing this predictable pattern
Right.
so that he can successfully burglarize her home.
Wow. Okay, so stands up to no good.
Not really a good guy in this scenario.
Not a great guy. Okay.
The second scenario introduces Brendan, who lives with a chronic illness and has developed a trusting relationship with his general practitioner, Dr. Smith, who's been managing his condition for many years.
Okay.
Brendan trusts that Dr. Smith will provide him with appropriate and compassionate care,
Right.
particularly now as his pain levels have recently increased.
Okay, so in both of these scenarios, we have a character relying on another person.
Exactly.
But it feels intuitively different to say that Stan trusts Jane compared to the way that Brendan trusts Dr. Smith.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, Stan is just counting on Jane's routine
Right.
for his own, nefarious purposes.
He's exploiting her predictability.
Exactly. There's no sense of like a deeper connection or shared understanding.
Right. It's purely transactional.
Right, or expectation of goodwill.
Right. Exactly.
Right. So what are some of the core philosophical perspectives that really illuminate this difference between reliance and genuine trust?
Well, the philosopher Russell Hardin argues that trust goes significantly beyond simply expecting someone to act in a predictable manner.
Okay.
He says that genuine trust also requires believing that your own interests are in some meaningful way encapsulated within the interests of the person you are trusting, and that they possess the appropriate motivations for acting in your best interest.
Okay, so they're not just going to do the right thing.
Right.
They want to do the right thing
Exactly, and they want to do the right thing for you specifically.
because they care about you.
Exactly.
That's really interesting.
It is, and Hardin puts it really well. He says, what matters is not merely my expectation that you will act in certain ways, but also my belief that you have the relevant motivations to act in those ways, that you deliberately take my interests into account because they are mine.
So it's about those underlying motivations.
Absolutely.
Okay. Oh,
And he goes on to say that he wouldn't trust a fully programmed automaton, even if it were meticulously designed to serve his interests, although he might rely on it for specific tasks.
right. So you might rely on your Roomba to clean your floors,
Exactly.
but you don't necessarily trust it.
You don't have that same kind of relationship with it.
Right.
It's not a moral agent in the same way that a human being is.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, it really gets to the heart of what we mean by trust.
So what insights do other philosophers offer on this distinction?
Well, Annette Bayer emphasizes that trust fundamentally involves a reliance on another person's goodwill towards you, as opposed to simply relying on their predictable habits or self-serving motives.
Okay, so again, we're back to that idea of motivation.
Exactly. And Karen Jones builds on this, offering a perspective that defines trust as an attitude of optimism
Okay.
regarding another person's goodwill, coupled with a confident expectation that they will be favorably moved by knowing that you are depending on them.
So it's not just that they're going to do the right thing, it's that they care that you're counting on them to do the right thing.
Exactly. And that your reliance on them actually matters to them.
Wow, that's a really nuanced
It is.
perspective on trust.
Yeah, and I think it really highlights the difference between the kind of trust we have in other human beings
Mm-hmm.
and the kind of reliance we might have on a machine.
Right. So the recurring theme here seems to be this essential element of goodwill,
Right.
of genuinely caring about the other person's well-being. And this is precisely where current AI systems inherently fall short.
Exactly as they currently exist.
Mm-hmm.
AI systems lack genuine motivations in any meaningful human sense.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have personal interest, let alone a sense of goodwill or concern for our well-being.
And this difference raises these really profound questions about whether we can actually extend the concept of interpersonal trust
Yeah.
to these non-sentient systems.
It's a fundamental mismatch, I think.
Okay, our source also brings up a really important distinction between normative and descriptive expectations.
What?
In the context of trust, what's the difference?
Reliance is often based on what we call descriptive expectations.
Yeah. Okay.
We predict that someone or something will behave in a certain way based on past experience or observed patterns.
Okay, so it's kind of like a prediction.
Exactly. It's like saying the sun will rise tomorrow because it's always risen before.
Right.
Trust, however, frequently involves what we call normative expectations.
Okay.
We believe that someone ought to behave in a certain way,
Okay.
and this belief creates a sense of obligation or responsibility on their part.
So it's not just that they will do it, it's that they should do it.
Exactly, and that's a really important distinction.
So when we trust a clinician, for instance,
Mhm.
there's this implicit understanding that they have this professional and ethical responsibility to act in our best interests.
Right, and that's linked to those fiduciary obligations we were talking about earlier.
Right, and this inherent sense of obligation and responsibility is something that's fundamentally lacking in AI systems.
Absolutely. AI systems, as we understand them today, are not moral agents in the same way that humans are.
Mm-hmm.
So while a human doctor can be held directly responsible and even blamed for medical errors or negligence,
Right.
it feels inherently inappropriate to blame an AI system for a misdiagnosis that leads to patient harm.
It's not a person, you can't yell at it.
Exactly. You can't hold it morally accountable in the same way.
So in those cases where an AI makes a mistake, where does the responsibility lie?
It would likely fall on the system's designers,
Okay.
the supervising clinicians who deployed it, or the institution that utilizes it.
Right. It's a much more complex web of responsibility.
It is, and that makes it really difficult to know where to place blame when things go wrong.
Yeah. So to kind of summarize the philosophical argument, the source highlights two critical deficits in patient-AI relationships when it comes to genuine trust.
Okay.
The first is this fundamental absence of genuine motivation within the AI system. And then the second is its inherent inability to bear these normative obligations or moral responsibility.
Exactly. Those are the two key things that distinguish trust from mere reliance.
And our source uses this really helpful analogy. We can be supremely confident that the sun will rise every morning.
Right.
And we relied on that predictability, but we wouldn't typically say that we trust the sun to rise.
Because it's not a person. It doesn't have intentions or motivations.
It's not making a choice to do so.
Exactly.
So trust in that interpersonal sense that's so vital in medicine fundamentally requires that element of agency.
Absolutely. It requires a belief that the entity you're trusting is capable of making choices and acting on those choices.
So the overarching conclusion here seems to be that as we rely more and more on AI in medicine, we are potentially fostering a shallower or at least fundamentally different form of trust.
I think that's a really important point and something we need to be mindful of as we move forward with these technologies.
Yeah, and it's not to say that AI can't be incredibly valuable in medicine, but it's just that we need to be clear about what we mean when we talk about trust.
Exactly. And we need to recognize that trustworthy AI might be more accurately understood as reliable AI.
Okay, so reliability is part of it.
It's a necessary but not sufficient condition.
Got it.
While reliability is crucial, it doesn't fully capture the complex essence of interpersonal trust,
Right.
which necessitates that kind of agency, motivation, and capacity for moral obligation that AI currently lacks.
Right, and even Thomas Metzinger, who's a member of that European Union's high-level expert group on AI, has expressed a similar view.
Yeah, he's been quite vocal about this distinction.
So while AI holds this incredible promise for driving these advancements and efficiencies in healthcare,
Absolutely.
it can't truly replicate that unique and profoundly valuable element of interpersonal trust.
Right, and that's something we need to hold on to.
Yeah, that forms the bedrock of the doctor-patient relationship.
Absolutely.
It really does. And it suggests that as patients rely more and more on AI for medical information and decision support, they might be missing out on opportunities to cultivate those deeper, more meaningful, and ultimately more human, trusting relationships with the clinicians who care for them.
That's a sobering thought, isn't it?
It really is. And it's not to say that AI can't be a part of that,
Right.
but it's just that we need to be really thoughtful about how we integrate it.
I think that's the key takeaway here.
Yeah, this has been a really fascinating and thought-provoking deep dive into a really complex and increasingly relevant issue.
It really is.
It really makes you consider, the very essence of trust and
Right.
how it underpins such a fundamental aspect of our lives as our health and well-being.
It's something that affects all of us.
So here's a final provocative thought for you, our listener.
Okay.
As artificial intelligence becomes more deeply integrated into the fabric of healthcare, how do we proactively ensure that we retain those deeply human aspects of medicine that we've discussed today? Those vital elements of genuine trust, empathy, and compassionate care.
It's a question we all need to be asking ourselves.
What does this increasing reliance on sophisticated technology ultimately mean for the future of the patient-physician bond? And what concrete steps can we as a society take to safeguard those essential human connections in an increasingly automated world?
Yeah, that's a great question to leave our listeners with.
It's certainly something for all of us to consider.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Thanks, everyone.